As many of you probably caught wind of, it wasn't too long ago when the United States decided to pack up and leave Afghanistan after ditzing about in the country for some 20 years. And depending on your age, that may or may not be significant to you. Obviously, if you're a Zoomer, you either didn't exist or you had other struggles in your life, such as not defecating and urinating on yourself when it happened, when we went in, as they say, to Afghanistan on the premise of rooting out Osama bin Laden and later nation building, a term you almost never hear these days. And it's interesting because the pulling out of Afghanistan, to my mind, syncs very well with political changes that have taken place over the last 20 or so years, and arguably over even more decades. Because if you go back in time, there was a general interest in foreign policy and global politics, and in particular wars abroad. And that is something that has dwindled to all but nothing in the course of time, in particular over the last 20 years. And there's some reasons for this, which I will go into in a bit. But I want to remind you guys of a time, even before my time, in the 60s, when an incident occurred during the Vietnam War, the so-called Milai Massacres, when a unit or company of American soldiers ended up committing absolutely horrific atrocities on defenseless Vietnamese villagers. And it was so bad at the time that the guy who was flying in, this guy named Hugh Thompson, was aghast at what happened and basically called out to his fellow American soldiers that he would open fire on them if they didn't stop. And when I say atrocities, there's certain things I cannot say on YouTube, but imagine some of the worst possible things you could do to people, and that probably happened during that massacre. And it was a national travesty. It was regarded as a disgrace. Of course, originally it was called into question, but the point I'm trying to drive home is not a lesson about Vietnam or really dwelling on this all too much, but rather there was a national interest in what happened. And in general, during that time, the Vietnam War, part of it was because of the nature of the draft and because if you were sufficiently young, you would have been dragged into it and, of course, possibly lost your life. But in general, there was much more political engagement in the foreign policy sphere, in the world at large. And over time, the U.S. government learned how to basically cover their tracks up better, i.e. not allow investigative reporters to get involved in wars because of the results they tended to report and show the citizens of the country. In fact, that was one of the major lessons learned during Vietnam because there was so much investigative journalism, so much reporting going on, it was a PR disaster for the government. You fast forward a couple of decades later, and people had lost a lot of interest in foreign policy, but it had continued to some degree. So for example, during the first war in Iraq in the 1990s, and so it goes until we get 9/11, which of course I'm sure all of you know, 20 years ago, anniversary recently took place, and the invasion of Afghanistan, then Iraq. And in light of that, there was just a profound interest, renewed interest in foreign policy. There were early podcasts, such as this libertarian podcast, antiwar.com, where you would get a lot of people on to discuss American foreign policy and what's going on in the world. And there was a guy named Chalmers Johnson who since passed away, famously produced this trilogy called the Blowback Trilogy about the sorrows of empire and what have you. And a lot of interest was generated. And then the social media revolution took place. And what do I mean by that? Well, isn't it interesting how little interest, frankly speaking, people have taken in the withdrawal from Afghanistan? A lot of this has to do with the fact that the people who would take interest in it either didn't exist or, again, fighting their own battles against defecating upon themselves or urinating upon themselves, or just generally speaking were young millennials who didn't really catch wind of it. But in general, social media has had, on the one hand, a globalizing effect, but on the other hand, very much what I would claim a localizing effect. You would think in the world we live in, this world of social media where everything is reported, and if something goes awry on Jones Street in the middle of nowhere in Arkansas, somebody catches wind of it, and the whole country is up in arms. When we look at the Afghanistan affair, where the Taliban has effectively taken over again, nobody bats an eyelash. Nobody cares or gives a rat's buttocks about it, seemingly. And that, I think, is due to a number of reasons. The first reason I already cited, generational gaps. If you're only 20, you weren't even around, why would you care about that? But when you're that young, you also grow quite literally into a new cultural generation that is concerned with other things than the generations previously were concerned with. And so politically, these days, as all of you know, the political currency of our time is not being interested in the affairs of other countries, but rather what happens locally. For example, what happened with the interest in George Floyd. And that's an interesting dynamic there. Whatever you think about the George Floyd affair, even though it involved only one man who unfortunately was killed, had garnered far more interest than leaving Afghanistan behind after 20 years and giving it back to the Taliban and everything that follows from that. We can all imagine what is following from that and what will follow from that. So in theory, the fates of untold millions versus the fate of one unfortunate man. But that's what social media has done. It has localized things far more than you would think, because you would think that given the technology available, the affairs of the world would be much more interesting to people, but they're not. They're interested locally, and human beings have always been interested locally. On top of that, you have the other effect of social media, which has led to an inflation of the human ego. So back in the day, nobody really cared if you were from Jonestown, wherever, because it just wasn't that interesting. But now, in the current meta, where you can get on a social media platform and proclaim your importance to the world and produce selfies and get on Instagram, everyone is a celebrity, at least in theory. And so all of these other things that potentially might be important or relevant fall into the backdrop of obscurity. And I'm not even commenting on whether it was right or wrong to leave Afghanistan or go into there. I certainly have my opinions of that. That's a separate video and a separate discussion. But you would think something as remarkable as that, after 20 years, you just pick up and leave, and rather rapidly, would have garnered more attention. But no, it didn't. Single incidents in the United States, such as the George Floyd affair, or similar events, garner more interest, not just from the American public, but from the global public, than the mass departure of a country that had been militarily involved in another country for 2 decades. And so it goes with basically everything happening en masse on the ground elsewhere. It really is about the hyper-localized effect of social media. And it happens in terms of people looking for their celebrity status, but also in terms of what people consider important and relatable. And broad foreign policy concerns are simply not one of them. Nobody really cares anymore about the so-called war on terror. Ridiculous term, mind you, because terror isn't something you can really wage war on, metaphors aside. But all that stuff is in the past. And I would be very surprised indeed going forward, if either the American public or any sort of Western public in general rekindles any interest in what's happening in the rest of the world outside of the localized cultural and political concerns that they seem to be very much obsessed about. You can see it in placards and stickers and banners and everything. We all know the issues they like to talk about and things they like to obsess over. But arguably, these global affairs, don't understand them, might be just as important, if not more so. But that is not the current cultural meta we live in, due largely to social media. Social media creates bubbles, and these bubbles, in conjunction with generational gaps and generational transformation, lead to fundamental changes in the political and cultural meta over time. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. Please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button if you're not yet a subscriber, hit the bell icon to be informed of my videos, because YouTube suppresses my videos, and do share the video. As always, if I'm still alive, I'll check you out later. May the gods watch over you. You take care. Bye-bye. Until the next time. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.